So in this video, we're going to be asking the question, how powerful is society in shaping who we are as human beings? And what happens if someone was to miss the experience of society? What kind of effect would that have on that person? And how would they even be human in the way that we understand humans? And what would there be limitations that they might face and things like that? So these are big questions again. And this is the part where, as I mentioned earlier, we'll be talking about some pretty intense looks at child abuse and neglect. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. But as I'm doing that, think about feral children, and if you have an understanding of what that term is or what it means within sociology, because it's a pretty significant term or idea within sociology, and it's something that you may be somewhat familiar with already, or you might not be. All right, so when we are thinking about feral children, we might be thinking about someone who is maybe raised by wolves or by animals, or some of these kind of stories that we maybe have seen in movies, Disney movies, like Tarzan, like Jungle Book, these kinds of ideas. We might be thinking of someone who is maybe raised by animals or things like that. But that's not necessarily what we're talking about. We're talking about someone who's missed a significant part of the childhood socialization process. Now, this could, in some cases, mean someone who was living out in the wild and was found. So, for example, there is the case of Victor, who was found. He was found a couple hundred years ago and studied, and he was brought in to be studied and kind of analyzed. But there are other cases too, where someone maybe has experienced severe neglect and different forms of abuse, where this can be considered possibly a feral child as well, because they have missed a significant part of the socialization experience. So before I explain a little bit more about feral children in particular, I'll just mention this other example. So Renee Spitz, she studied children who were raised in an orphanage in Romania. Now these children, there were 45 children and just 6 nurses, and they had very limited interaction. So the babies were often left in the cribs for long periods of time. And one of the things that they noticed that these babies often didn't cry very much at all. And one of the thoughts about that is that they knew that their needs would not be met by crying. So a lot of them were fairly silent. And so Renee Spitz, she compared them with children who were raised in a nursery attached to a women's prison. And so these children got to interact with their mothers in this prison. And she found that when she looked at them as they grew up, that there was a lot more problems with these children that were raised in this orphanage, where they didn't have as much interaction, that they were more likely to have different kind of psychological issues as they grew, to find difficulty establishing relationships and things like that. So this is just one example of a study like this. Now, there is a powerful documentary on this case of Jeannie, which I'm going to be talking about in a moment. It is a bit harder to find online now because it's a bit older. It came out in 1994, and I also included, but the case of Jeannie is from the 1970s. But you can find, and I'll put up a link, you can find a link to the entire transcript of the movie. You may also be able to find the movie if you look online, if you look it up, it's called Jeannie, Secret of the Wild Child. And so this case, in this case, what happened is Jeannie was discovered when she was about 13 years old, And Jeannie is not her actual name. It was a name that was given to her. She was found, and she was recognized right away that there was an abusive situation going on, because she showed signs of extreme neglect, and she didn't know how to speak. She didn't walk upright. She didn't have a lot of the characteristics we would expect of someone around that age, and actually they thought she was much younger than she was. And so what they found out is that she was raised in extreme neglect. So she was alone in a room, and she was actually tied to a potty chair. And she was given food, but not taken care of. There was very limited kind of interaction with her whatsoever. And so she didn't learn how to speak. And so when her case was discovered, it raised the thought that maybe that all of these different scientists, that they could help her, and they could understand her, and that they could maybe progress and show that someone could learn at this point in their lives. Because there was a debate about, is there a limitation on when a person can learn a language? And is there a limitation on when someone can learn how to interact with others? And so she was brought in, and unfortunately, her treatment in the scientific community, while they were very interested in her, it also led to different types of abandonment in her life too, because there were all of these types of research done, and she was brought into different families and things like that, and people connected with her, but then funding ran out and things like that, and they really, there's a lot of concern about the way that she was treated, even by these scientists and beyond and into her life. So with her case, it raised all these questions about, well, can we teach her language? And so they were able to progress, and she was able to learn some words, but she struggled to put these words into sentences, and that remained a problem. And this is similar to other cases of other feral children, like the Victor case that I mentioned before, that there seemed to be a certain level where they could obtain, and then certain kind of limitations as well. And unfortunately, she was also subject to abuse at different homes, and she ended up actually being lost into the system, the foster care system. And so it's a tragic story, and a lot of the other cases like this are similarly tragic. But they raise this term. So in the documentary, it talks about it being a forbidden experiment, because you cannot ethically, of course, raise someone without socialization, because you're depriving them of all of these things that they might need. So it's a certain matter of finding these cases and then trying to learn from them. So that is the case about Jeannie. There's other cases too. But yeah, so feral children are people who miss out on a significant part of kind of that formative socialization process. So that is part of that question. Well, how do we function as people? Can we learn to function if we don't grow up within society? Do we think about how powerful society actually is in our lives? So moving on from that, well, can we find a way of defining socialization, which is kind of the central thing that we're discussing today? So socialization, it starts from the time we're born, sometimes even with the expectations of parents beforehand. So socialization it's an ongoing thing, and that's something that we're going to discuss. That of course is extremely significant when we are children, but also as we grow, that we're always being socialized. We're always being shaped in our personalities, in our ways of finding meaning, in our ways of learning how to interact with the world. We're always being shaped by the people and the social forces around us. So who we are as individual people is being shaped by the the family environment that we experience, by the peers that we interact with, by the education system, all of these things, that they all have a specific effect on who we become as individuals. So part of this claim then is our personality. It's deeply connected to the way that we experience the world with other people. And so that's one of the things that we're going to be discussing. And if we think about personality, what we're talking about is just the kind of complete total of how we think about the world, how we think about the people around us, how we think about ourselves, how we feel, and how we act. So all of that stuff, the argument is that it's deeply related to how we interact with other people and how we're socialized by the world around us. So, and as I mentioned, it's an ongoing thing. It's something that happens as we go into different workplaces, as we navigate different spaces of higher education. All of these different moments in our lives, we're being shaped by the society around us. And maybe we're reacting back and changing it too, but it's all about that relationship. That's what we want to discuss. So that is really what we're talking about when we talk about socialization. And we're going to break it down in some different ways as we go today. But that is just kind of where we're starting from today. So that is where I'm going to end this video. And we're going to talk a little bit in the next video about some symbolic interactionist thoughts about socialization and personality. So that's kind of where we're moving to next.